Approximately 10 feet over his neck, the menacing rim of a sharpened blade casts a gloom upon a mass of black hair. A gentleman is restrained beneath the execution machine, under the darkest, most terrifying shadow that could ever darken one's spirit. He gazes, bright emerald eyes, desolate and blank, when confronted by the inescapable force of the darkness that hovers above. The green-eyed prisoner cannot help but ponder how circumstances reached this point. An observer, a woman in the multitude, inquired what the nobleman had done to warrant such degradation, and another man reprimanded her, suggesting she guard her speech or she might be the next victim. She ought to have witnessed enough to comprehend what brutal oppressors governed them. The sole action the common populace could take in this scenario was to remain silent and avoid conflict. Now that conflict had engulfed the entire continent, ordinary individuals like them were compelled to be as still as field mice. Ravens and corvids circled above the execution stand as many assembled to observe the forthcoming slaughter. It was an era of conflict and adversity. Once the flames of bloodshed grasped the entire eastern landmass, the lethal inferno simply refused to diminish, causing the revered whole House of Marbas to become the newest casualty of this awful confrontation. The final inheritor knelt before the people, trapped within the killing apparatus as he awaited his demise. Thus, destiny extracts its heavy cost. The strong pursue their desires, while the weak quietly endure to survive. Unlike the robust, the weak were obliged to jeopardize their existence every single day, praying they wouldn't finish as sustenance for the birds. In contrast to the powerful, the disadvantaged had to engage in a struggle with fatality itself, eventually, by one route or another. The entrances of the inferno were the only location where the vulnerable could anticipate the welcome relief of their termination. This was the hellish scenario to which the land had been diminished. The leader of Clan Sylvester, a rival dynasty to House Marbas, Count Alan de Sylvester, sat with an arrogant, loathsome smirk on his face as he contemplated his triumph. The fellow requested that the spectacle commence, and murmurings echoed throughout the assembly. The executioner, a youthful male who possessed a strange and noticeable likeness to the individual scheduled to perish, was immobilized in place, earning the contempt of the Sylvester lord. The wicked noble once more commanded the killing to commence. At this moment, the counterpart struggled onward, swaying as he proceeded, his grip tightening on the dagger he carried. The restrained figure of his victim was directly ahead, and the boy stopped beside the guillotine's cord, apprehension surging through him. The Lord of Sylvester could scarcely conceal his pleasure and requested the youth to promptly sever the rope. Again, the executioner advanced laboriously and stood over the cord that determined another's existence. Slowly, the lookalike's arms ascended, the certainty of the circumstance weighing heavily on his emotions and on the spirits of those observing. The Lord of Sylvester leaned forward in expectation as the cord was sliced in a decisive cut. The grim reality was that the fatal sound of the sharp blade separating a neck was indistinguishable from the heavy blow of a cleaver against a butcher's block. The executioner gazed in blank-eyed terror as drops of deep red fluid created a gruesome pale surface on his complexion. The fluid barely registered, and neither did the moisture flowing down his cheeks. It only lent undeniable verification to the dark picture amidst the metallic scent. In fate's merciless style, this was the impossible responsibility the young person was tasked to endure. To rid the world of Leon von Marbas. No, to sever all connections between the earthly realm and his own progenitor. The liquid collecting on the ground belonged to the one who had formerly fathered him and embraced him securely. Truly, the young boy with the empty gaze closely resembled the deceased because they shared a biological link. The child was Leon von Marbas, the progeny of the departed Leon von Marbas, and a relative killer who functioned as his father's executioner. The head of the family, this was the title frequently given to the chieftain of the noble lineage. As the designation implies, the patriarch is not only a member of the elite class, but also constitutes a central support of the nation. However, as one playwright famously stated, uneasy sits the head that wears the royal circlet. The obligation of authority must only be granted to those capable of bearing it. Now Leon was sitting at a dinner table amidst an aggregation of aristocrats. He was currently the new head of House Marbas, and he watched as the nobles argued amongst themselves vehemently. Some were distressed at the rapid expansion of House Sylvester, daily, and there was no way of knowing when they might openly seize Marbas's domain. A government official stated that it would be crucial for them to reinforce their security, and they insisted that their patriarch decide immediately. They wanted to hear their wise counsel. Nonetheless, Leon simply dismissed the official. He instructed his council to remain patient just a short while longer, expressing his need for additional time to deliberate. The others were naturally disappointed to hear this, proclaiming it a pressing concern. The present circumstances predicted misfortune for the formerly prominent House Marbas. After the death of his sire, Lord Leon von Marbas, Leon von Marbas had ascended to the role of patriarch of House Marbas at the tender age of 14. House Marbas was once feared as a mighty organization of dark sorcerers, although that prestige had long since faded into the historical records. The boy paused before the suspended images of his deceased parents. His mother and his father were no longer living, and he considered what actions they would take in his position. The child understood that his request would go unanswered, for the dead hold no conversation, and his progenitors could not offer wisdom from the afterlife.
The continent, during his era. It is recounted that their house first achieved notoriety as the original Marbas patriarch made his standing on the battlefield. However, ever since the peak of their founding progenitor, their descendants had consistently failed to produce another accomplished necromancer. This subsequently led their family wealth down a track of deterioration. The young fellow sighed. Ultimately, he had been coerced into ending his own father's existence, and he opened the door to his private workspace. Proceeding inside, the boy ambled toward the desk and brushed dust off a copy of the records of their family ancestry. The inaugural Marbas patriarch, Leon von Marbas, was an almost mythical character. With a gesture of his hand, he would eliminate his adversaries like a deadly squall, calling forth hordes of a deceased in an infinite lethal march. By the time the eastern territories had been brought under his dominion, barely 2 months had transpired completely. It was claimed that Wellen had forged an alliance with the fiend Marbas and uncovered one of the great puzzles of the continent, specifically the secrets of controlling the dead using the ominous grimoire, the Necronomicon. This then provided their founder with the strength required to govern as the ruler of the landmass. Now, the adolescent chief was observing the Necronomicon itself, a massive black volume featuring an eye centered on its cover. It was an invaluable relic that had been inherited from their forefather himself and the very manuscript that led to the elevation of House Marbas as the exclusive lineage of dark sorcerers on the continent. Naturally, all those glorious periods are gone now. Leon casually turned the pages of the massive book, but froze when a voice spoke out. The sound requested the young patriarch to heed carefully. Leon was startled and questioned the source of that voice. He speculated if a mental message had reached the leader's chamber despite the magical barrier. Choosing to address the situation directly, the young fellow inquired who he was conversing with. The voice responded that Leon had no cause for alarm and that it presented no danger to the youth or his relatives. The young lord questioned why he should accept such an audacious declaration, and a crimson magical ring materialized around him, overwhelming him with a brilliant eruption of energy. Leon managed to force his eyes open and glance up in astonishment and surprise to behold a massive demonic creature standing before him. Stunned, the young lord inquired about his location, and the demon pondered, asking if the family's predecessor had neglected to inform them of its presence. The boy was amazed, asking if the entity knew his sire. The entity did indeed know his sire, and it knew him by name. The being sensed that the connection linking them had been broken, so now it had appeared to Leon. The creature growled, asserting that it had long worried that Rune's temperament was much too gentle for the leader of a sinister dynasty. It should have anticipated that Rune would face an premature end. In any case, it wasn't going to mourn the loss, and it moved closer to Leon, inquiring who had delivered his father's fatal blow. A highly uncomfortable discussion had arisen, but the despondent-eyed boy simply responded that the individual who took his father's life had been none other than the one currently facing the creature. Leon von Marbas had been the one to end his own father's life. This provoked a tremendous burst of fury from the Marbas entity. The being was surprisingly outraged, and it stated that it would pose the question to the boy one final time. With a perilous snarl and an aura that boiled with fierce power, the creature asked if Leon was the one who murdered his oath-bound ally. Once more, the young, empty-eyed child affirmed that he had been the one to slay his sire. The demon's eyes glowed with fierce scarlet anger, and it sprang at the boy with a ferocious sound. The youth gazed at the advancing entity, only a slight look of astonishment on his features as he stared into the jaws of destruction. He could still remember the bloodstains on his hands. It was as if the demon was examining his recollections. Marbas witnessed the collapsed form of his previous lord, and the emotionless tears the young boy had shed. Perceiving the truth, the demon announced that Leon had been bereft of his sanity. The hands that cut the cord were his, but the child had not genuinely executed his father. However, Leon insisted that this conclusion was inaccurate. The demon observed the miserable boy, a hint of amusement on the massive lion's face. The youth is desperate. What truly escaped the demon's comprehension was the profound dark energy it could feel within the child. The all-consuming gloom lingered beneath the surface of the young lord's skin, and the demon couldn't help but be curious how such an adolescent had become this melancholic. A child shouldn't possess such a potent reservoir of mystical energy. There was a disturbance in the area as the boy stepped ahead, and examining closer, the demon could identify energy surging beneath the boy's feet, red and menacing, with many forms writhing along with it. The demon was shocked and believed that the scene it was currently witnessing was utterly preposterous. The boy before him had the capacity to potentially even exceed his forefather. Marbas cleared its throat briefly and chose to introduce itself. It was Marbas, one of the 72 infernal entities who abandoned the demonic realm and opted to coexist with humanity instead. A lifelong companion of Leon von Marbas and the genesis of the dark magic that became the distinct craft of House Marbas. The boy recognized the demon from the legends. When the founder established House Marbas, the demon was the one who instructed him in the forbidden art of commanding the dead. Indeed, the massive creature was the very manuscript that led to the elevation of House Marbas as the exclusive lineage of dark sorcerers on the continent.
Same one the boy spoke of. Nevertheless, it was now bound to the Necronomicon because it was a formidable fiend long ago. Marbas the Black Lion, the founding patriarch, frequently asserted that the dark arts ran in the blood of the members of their noble house. However, Leon could not grasp why the great lion deserted them in the end. The boy's eyes flared with suppressed indignation, and the demon was puzzled by his accusation. The lion inquired why the boy would harbor such a belief, so Leon elaborated. Ever since the time of their ancestor, Lord Wellen, House Marbas has been unable to produce a necromancer of his ability. This was surely an indication then that the lion of their lineage had abandoned them. The lion listened to the boy's explanation, paying close attention, and then it decided to clarify a point. The reason why the noble family had been incapable of wielding the authentic might of a necromancer was that they were too feeble to provide a suitable conduit. The boy was perplexed and asked further about this conduit concept. Not a single member of the Marbas clan could compare to the sheer expertise that Wellen possessed. This was merely a prediction of their hereditary decline. Leon remained silent as he contemplated this answer to his inquiry. Then he decided to accept the lion's assertion, and the demon acknowledged that the boy was quick to embrace reality. Of course, for the vulnerable to suffer defeat during wartime was simply an unchangeable rule of the cosmos.
The lion wondered aloud if this was how the boy had reconciled with his father's death. The boy stated that it would make no difference. Honestly, there was nothing exceptional about his father's departure. And that being said, unless the demon had entirely forsaken their house, the boy had a request to present to Lord Marbas. The enormous lion was curious about this request, and it declared that it would grant no such thing. A request was an act of goodwill in which one potentially stands to incur a cost. The boy should refer to any transaction with a fiend as a covenant or a bargain. So the young patriarch agreed to a pact for the ability of dark sorcery. The two exchanged glances, and Leon inquired if it was within the lion's capability to grant that ability to him. The formidable demon sneered with its head lifted, stating that a mere boy had no right to question its power. Moreover, it wondered what precisely it had observed in the boy to make it bestow him with its power. Did the youth genuinely believe he possessed the potential worthy to wield its potent necromancy? Without delay, the boy responded that he did possess the potential, and, had he been some unskilled peasant, he would never have been permitted to trade communications with such an elevated fiend. Ultimately, it was claimed that common individuals needed only to merely chat with the demon before they were stripped of all magical energy, experienced spectral visions, and finally forfeited their lives once the creature finished with them. Considering that the youngster currently remained upright, it could only signify that he was worth at least a test. He possessed some measure of capability. The monster could not criticize the young fellow's reasoning, as he himself could perceive that the child had aptitude and courage. Indeed, Marbas declared that any solicitation of a demon would constitute a covenant, and that was vital to recall. The boy asserted that it was not irrational to believe that he might possess something valuable to provide in exchange. The demon fixed its gaze upon the youth for a moment before simply bursting into maniacal mirth. There was absolutely no chance this juvenile could offer anything of consequence to the enormous beast. Nevertheless, he was intrigued by the proposition. Captivated, the lion stated that he would establish an agreement with the young sovereign of the dark sorcery lineage. Subsequently, Leon inquired what compensation the demon would demand from him, and the massive creature grinned malevolently. With a vicious smirk, Marbas announced that his fee would encompass every component of Leon's essence. The hollow-eyed lord stared intensely and at length at his family antiquity and smiled just as wickedly as he declared that this was a relief to hear, for he would willingly relinquish every element of his insignificant existence. It was a great solace to know, as Leon would gleefully sacrifice every fragment of this paltry life, and the lion recoiled momentarily upon witnessing such an evil smirk on such a young boy. In the interim, back within the deliberation chamber, the aristocrats were assembled and they sat in quietude. Eventually, the elderly man began to speak, stating that as the majority of the gentlemen were cognizant, their current patriarch, Leon von Marbas, commands minimal authority to make judgments of grave significance that impact the entire household. Though impeccably dressed, the old man had clearly exhibited some uncouth demeanor upon entering the entrance, and he questioned if the other members of the Marbas council concurred. Since they offered no disagreement, he accepted that as approval and proceeded. Therefore, in the old man's capacity as the uncle and nearest relative of the existing patriarch, he intended to take control of all matters concerning their lineage for the foreseeable future. The boy had departed for merely a few moments, and his advisory board was already plotting to betray him. Now the uncle asserted that he would permit the remaining council to voice their sentiments regarding his installation as the estate manager. One of the other nobles declared that they would be foolish to dissent, considering that the alternative is a mere fledgling who had not yet reached the required age to inherit the domain, or anything specific. Consequently, the individual with the slicked-back hairstyle voted for the uncle to assume command, proclaiming that they could not entrust these essential determinations to an undeserving youth. He believed there was no better candidate to manage the affairs of the house than the uncle, Sir Kirchel.
That as it may, the gentleman with the moustache objected to the proposal. Lord Leon was the sole direct blood descendant of the former patriarch. There was no established custom in their familial history for appointing the succeeding patriarch in violation of direct ancestry. Nevertheless, the dissenting man contended that tradition would not assist them if their entire bloodline were annihilated. He presented a highly compelling argument. The forces of those Sylvester ruffians were advancing against them at that very instant. Slicked Hair could not fault Moustache for hesitating and expressing reservations concerning legitimate birthright and related matters, but they needed to realize that voting against the uncle meant choosing to perish alongside the oblivious young noble. Slicked Hair, conversely, would prioritize his own survival initially. Moustache emphatically struck his palm against the table, accusing the other noblemen of speaking inappropriately. Every single one of them was granted a seat at this council by the benevolence of the departed lord. They owed it to this dynasty to contend until the very end, not quarrel like a pack of scavengers. Even if the current patriarch had yet to assemble his own supporters, Moustache would not stand idly by and observe his uncle seize his rightful position as successor. The uncle was a malicious, domineering presence, nearly as treacherous and unpardonable as the individual who had executed the previous lord. And Moustache hoped for direction from Rune's spirit. It was genuinely unfortunate that their esteemed lord had abandoned them to the clutches of this unscrupulous predator. The uncle chuckled softly, stating that it was certainly a brave yet entertaining viewpoint. Leon von Marbas, their current patriarch, possessed at least one faithful servant, it appeared. Moustache instructed the uncle to speak plainly, as he had no patience for games. As devoted as Moustache might be, he lacked any sort of cunning required in political maneuverings. The uncle, conversely, possessed excessive cunning, and he could plainly see that the situation was already decided. No other aristocrat at the table had opposed the arrangement, and Moustache stood with concern etched on his face. Portland, That was his name, and he was a kind older gentleman. Therefore, the uncle advised the man to heed his wise counsel and to relinquish the issue. After all, the uncle had summoned them all today, and it was certainly not because he had any consideration for Pollen's views whatsoever. The mustachioed man would not be intimidated, and he cursed, recognizing that this circumstance was orchestrated by the wicked uncle. Kirchel told the stout man to weigh his upcoming remarks cautiously for the benefit of his household, if nothing else. The mustachioed man tensed as he was reminded that they had all gathered for one objective, solely to execute an unpleasant decision that would nonetheless represent the least detrimental option for the lineage. The stout man had no reason to obstruct their preservation, and all they requested was for him to allow their collective judgment to take precedence. The mustachioed man was beginning to understand that he was merely a pawn in the uncle's scheme from the very beginning. The man implored the deceased lord's spirit to pardon and show compassion for a miserable retainer who failed to safeguard his heritage. While all this transpired, Leon was occupied acquiring some impressive new infernal capabilities. He stood before the colossal fiend Marbas, and the lion mused, noting that all was satisfactory, except for one detail. Due to the alteration in the subject of the agreement, the actual scope of the lion's strength had been restricted. As gentle and guileless as his father Rune was, as Marbas's contractor, the man had commanded a much larger magical reserve than his son currently held. Upon reflection, the boy did seem to recall that any demon who entered a covenant with a mortal had to draw mystical energy from their contractor to replenish their own supply. The boy then wanted to know his responsibilities in that regard, and he wished to accelerate the procedure. The colossal lion mentioned that there was remarkably little the boy could achieve in his present state. However, they should make do with his current magical power for the time being. With a quick snap of his digits, the enormous volume opened, and the great lion adopted a more manageable shape to accommodate the quantity of energy the boy currently possessed. He now appeared very much like the world's fluffiest black feline. This iteration should be less taxing to sustain. Leon was not disheartened, and he reasoned that this made sense. The entity was certainly charming enough to be considered a domestic animal. The boy scarcely completed his compliment before Marbas's demon shadow flared with his actual form as he warned the youth to never again presume to call him adorable. He might be small momentarily, but he swore to cover his contractor's face in a maze of teeth and claw lacerations. Leon was not seriously intimidated by that menace, but for the purpose of securing what he wanted, he agreed to the term. The fuzzy feline rumbled, stating that now that we are in accord, it is time for us to depart. The boy was surprised and inquired about their destination. Clearly, the young lord aspired to gain power that would rival even his ancestor, and he certainly recalled asking for that. If he were to have any prospect of ascending to the same prominence that he did, then what superior method to emulate his path than to quite literally follow his exact route? It sounded acceptable enough to the young lord, so it was time for them to journey to the concealed sanctuary of his forefather. He was completely oblivious to his noble position being seized directly from beneath him. The dangers of the expedition they were about to undertake could claim his existence, and Marbas asked if Leon still intended to proceed. Of course he did. The boy couldn't care less about remaining alive, and he did not understand why his determination kept being questioned. The kitten was rather proud of him, and began to lead the way, instructing the young contractor to keep pace if he was able. So the young fellow followed, and the pair advanced into the nearby woods. The lad recognized the foggy groves belonging to House Marbas. The forest could be an impenetrable maze for those who were not of his lineage. Then the boy remembered that his father had informed him that only the rightful patriarch may place foot inside the confidential sanctuary itself. However, he found it peculiar that the location was supposed to grant
predecessors the ability of dark sorcery, but it had failed to accomplish that very thing. The kitten clarified that none of the predecessors had successfully completed the ordeal, and they had likely been judged deficient when it came to the most fundamental prerequisite of all. Only those who possessed the purest hue of black, the essence of the void, could clear a path to the sanctuary. No one to date had been capable of satisfying this initial condition to pass through the thick, swirling and magical purple vapor. The boy could see that it appeared quite obvious. Marbas raised a paw and the mist dissipated to reveal an entrance. Without further preamble, the kitten smiled, anxious to commence the primary challenge. Heir stood inside the location, and Leon was granted permission to enter as a descendant. The boy stepped forward, observing the masonry coated in moss. The boy was cautioned, naturally, that he would no longer have the demon's support. The boy accepted this, as the kitten had mentioned that it would be a test after all. The cat grinned and said that he did possess one piece of counsel to provide. The boy was to comply with the Necronomicon's guidelines at all times. It would guide the youth along the trajectory toward his reward. The capability of dark sorcery. It was dim at the base of the staircase, but there was sufficient illumination from lanterns and the glowing grimoire. Leon paused when he abruptly heard a shriek in the gloom, and he pivoted to look down the dark passage. One of the lamps ignited with a green light, and a group of green, bulky, and muscular beings materialized in the darkness. The boy stared down and saw beside him a maiden bound before the creatures that appeared to be goblins. With barely any response to the situation surrounding him, the boy seized his purple volume and opened a few sheets. He located the instruction manual on how to maximize the efficacy of the divine artifact, the Necronomicon. The first hidden technique was resurrecting the deceased. The boy stared at the book in silence for a moment, and he looked at the empty hallways and the goblins that were now rushing toward him. There did not seem to be any corpses to revive, so the boy looked back at the book, which stated he must initiate by ending a life. Well, he had already performed that action once before. Thus, he closed the volume and picked up his short sword, his eyes gleaming with the fierce resolution of an assassin. He noticed the restrained, voluptuous stranger and her torn garments.
evidently goblin entertainment, and the goblins snarled to see him ogling their captive. The young patriarch stepped forward, blade in hand, and then there was a sudden detonation as one of the goblins leaped into the air, yelling homicide. The boy was unaffected as the goblin approached, evading the creature's initial strike. Then he swung his weapon, cleaving the charging beast before him. It seems the boy had dedicated some time after patricide to honing his killing skills somewhat. Blood streamed from the felled goblin, and the boy spun, his eyes alight with death, to see who was next. The melancholy boy once found himself within a graveyard in